My name is Bonnie Browne. I was born Bonnie Taft on March the 8th, 1951. And I always heard my father go on about how nothing ever changes in this town. But by doing this project and looking at some facts, there was a tremendous amount of change happened from 1956 to 1965, which was actually the years when I was in public school. In 1956, the commission that was run by volunteers at the park, that was established in 1922, was stopped, and the Lands and Forests took over the park. A tremendous amount of change happened in the park. And the first year, the citizens really realized the change when they went, and if they wanted to swim or they wanted to picnic, they had to buy a park pass. There was now a campsite, and if they wanted to camp, they now had to pay for a daily entrance or fee to do that. I remember that first year they had swimming lessons at Presqu'ile. And also in that year, in September, the school had a new program. It was kindergarten, and I was in the first kindergarten class in the Brighton public school. And it was hard to believe that 5-year-olds were allowed to go to school for half a day. Then in July of 1961, the 401 was officially opened from Toronto to Belleville. In 1964, the CP station closed, and in 1968, the CN rail station closed, and now no longer did a train stop in Brighton. From 1961 to 1965, all the one-room schools closed, and larger schools were built, and the Northumberland-Durham Board of Education started in 1968. The final change was when the marketing boards came in the 60s and 70s, and that was the end of the family farm. Brighton had become a town in 1980. In 1984, it produced a Brighton Pictorial. And I remember looking through that Brighton Pictorial and looking at those marvelous pictures and thinking, I don't know the story behind that picture. There wasn't much written, and so I was asked to go through the files at Proctor House, and I thought, well, maybe we'll find some information about the two wars and the Depression years. There was one manuscript in that file, and it was done by Basil McMaster and Gerald Langdon, and it was about the apple industry in 1900 and the English export. So the first person I went to was Jim Simpson. And Jim Simpson's stories were so interesting that day. Jim Simpson was born in 1908 and died in 1993. In 1911, Jim's family moved to a 60-acre farm at 280 Ontario Street. It was a typical family farm, and his father, Darwin's horses, were always included in every village maintenance program. In my first interview with Jim, he told me about the heyday of the Presqu'ile Hotel and Pavilion. He told of the wealthy patrons that came from Rochester to Coburg by ferry, by train to Brighton Station, from Brighton Station to Gosport by carriage, and finally a boat to the hotel dock. They came with trunks full of clothes and stayed for weeks, and often came on an annual visit. He told about the rum runner Ben Kerr. A golf course started in 1922. An airstrip started in 1937. Jim was park superintendent from 1934 to 43. As superintendent, he received 35 cents an hour and 50 cents if he had his team. The taxes were collected from Grant Quick's hotel and the cottages, and this operated the park. Jim married Dorothy Chatton June 30th, 1928. Most of their 8 children would be raised on that 60-acre farm at 280 Ontario Street. When Jim later got a job in Trenton at the air base and got involved in local politics, his son did most of the farm work. Harold, his 6th born in 1944, recently wrote his memories, in which he stated, Number 1, if you expected to eat and you weren't sick, you contributed. Number 2, children were seen and not heard, and you never said you were bored because there was a new list of jobs. Number 3, work ethics and respect of others were preached daily. I embarked on a 20-year hobby of interviewing seniors and putting their memories down. I interviewed 120 seniors. I read 150 books and made notes on it. And that all came into the 6-volume series of the Brighton series, which was a self-published and over 800 pages. It would lead into bus trips and it would lead into walking trips, and it really was a fantastic journey. And I'm going to start with my grandmother. Her name was Cora McLaughlin, and her parents were William and Anne McLaughlin. Now, William McLaughlin was the blacksmith for Caring Place. So my grandmother was born in and raised in Caring Place, but she spent a lot of time in Brighton. And in 1946, she actually sat and wrote her memories. She would eventually marry Alvin Taft. He was called Elf, and he was one of 10 boys that were brought up in Caring Place. And they would move to Brighton in 1908. And at that time, Brighton had a population of just over 1,300. There were 5 blacksmiths in town. They moved into 55 Division Street, and it was a huge lot. They were able to have a garden. They had some chickens, and they had a couple of fruit trees. By 1913, they had 2 children. Bill was 4 and Anita was 2. Only now 55 Division Street was between 3 sets of tracks. The CP and the Grand Trunk was to the south. And to the north, just north of Richardson Street, was a new line called the Canadian Northern Ontario. And in this peak time, 22 passenger trains stopped in the village every business day. Everything went by train, including the mail. And 55 Division Street was not the only property between the tracks. If you went a little west, you would find 31 Richardson Street, which was the public school. And it's no doubt that the new school, built on 24 Elizabeth Street and opened in September of 1916, was a result of the fact that the old school was in between 3 sets of tracks. My father, Neil Taft, was born in 1928, and my uncle Ron was born in 1932. Of the 6 kids, 4 survived. And it would be years before families could afford to put a monument at Mount Hope Cemetery for those lost children. It was a really difficult time. In 1931, Elf now had his own shop on Park Street. And in 1939, he moved that building down to 11 Richardson Street. And Cora got her first camera in 1923, and I'm really glad she did, because I used dozens of her pictures in my Brighton series. She also liked to cut things out of newspapers, and she had a whole volume about the war. Not Europe, not battles, but living in Ontario. The slogan of the time was, use it up, wear it out, make do, and do without. And that's what these columns were all about. They talked about the Victory Gardens, and they talked about war bonds, and they did recipes, because we had rationing, and a lot of the old recipes had to be altered because there was rationed tea, coffee, butter, milk, meat, and sugar. Also, a lot of the columns talked about reuse. So reuse was really important, and if you were doing light material, that bits and pieces would be put together to do quilts. If it was heavier material, it quite often ended up in 55 Division Street, because Cora would take this heavier fabric and cut it into strips, and then she would braid it, and then she would sew it into round or oval rugs. And I still have the round rug that she made for the 1958 Fall Fair. And I remember going into 55 Division Street, and there's this big kitchen and this big cook stove, and on the cook stove were these huge pots, and she was taking all of these garments that that had been thrown away, and she was dyeing them because she needed more color. By 1958, Alf's shop was not doing so well. The farmers had now got tractors. Most family had a car. Welding shops were popping up all over. So the plan was he was going to move his equipment into a shed, and he was going to add an addition to the shop, and they were going to sell 55 Division, which they'd lived in for over 40 years, and they were going to move into the shop. And unfortunately, it didn't quite work out right because Elf died in 1960 and Cora ended up moving into the shop by herself. She died in 1977, and when my Uncle Ron moved out of Brighton years later, all of her treasures were dropped off at my house because it should be left in Brighton.